Welcome into a Friday edition of In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com. Hope you've enjoyed the week, and it is officially the final weekend of college basketball before we get to Selection Sunday and the beginning of March Madness next week. And I'd like to say that I'm very excited about it. And from an objective point of view, if you're a sports fan, you can't help but be excited about what comes with the NCAA tournament. But when you have a team that you don't know whether or not they're going to get in, that adds a little bit of anxiety heading into the Selection Sunday festivities, if you will. And I would say at this point, if you would have asked us a couple of episodes ago or a week ago if Indiana had lost in the first round of the Big Ten tournament, we thought they might still be in, except maybe, just one of the last four teams in. And that may still be the case. And we'll get into the latest edition of Joe Lunardi's bracketology here in a little bit. But I'm starting to think, and Joe Lunardi would agree, that Indiana fans maybe shouldn't be so optimistic heading into Sunday as maybe one would have originally predicted. And a lot of that is due to some results that have occurred within some of the other conference tournaments. So we'll talk more about that here in just a moment. Also, no guest today. This is going to be a fairly short edition of the show. I really just want to hit on all of the major Indiana basketball topics of the day, and then we'll call it a week here on the show. And then we'll pick back up on Monday, and we'll react to whether or not Indiana got in. And if they did, then we can be excited about that and look forward to the games to come, however far Indiana may go in this year's NCAA tournament. But if they don't get in, of course, that's more than likely the end of the season. And I know people will want to talk about NIT. Should they get in there? Or should they play in this new thing that's called the Crown? When you're about to usher in a new era of Indiana basketball, or, not even just Indiana, but if you're a program that's about to begin a new era of your team, I don't think that playing in the NIT or whatever tournament of your choosing that's not March Madness, I don't think that does you any favors, because you're going to now, I guess, if the coach that you're going to end up hiring is playing in the tournament still, which you would expect that to be the case for Indiana, then maybe, I guess, there is some benefit to playing in a different tournament if you're Indiana. Benefit in terms of for the players that are still around, because you won't really be able to begin building your team until you get access to your new head coach. Now, that's also something that we're going to get into later on in this episode. Is there's been a couple of reports over the last several hours, not just today, but going back to yesterday as well, about a couple of names that have really emerged as the two front runners for the Indiana job. And one of them is somebody that we've talked about frequently on the show. And another one is somebody that I don't even know if I've mentioned on this show specifically, but I've talked about the second candidate with a couple of people, not behind a microphone. So we'll get into that. But before we jump into all those different things, and plus we'll also, depending on if I don't want to say if I feel like it, that sounds like a negative way to look at it. There's really not a ton. I looked through some of the YouTube comments earlier. I do appreciate all of you who commented, but in terms of comments that are something I'd want to read on the air, or things that are more than just great show, which I always appreciate those, by the way, if you do send those in. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that there's not a bunch of comments to go through. So I may mention one or two here at the end of the show. I don't want to make that sound like I don't appreciate comments, because I do. And plus, there are several of you who sent in predictions for what you thought Indiana would have done against Oregon in the Big Ten tournament. I think a couple of you put the same thing. Indiana would beat Oregon by 7. And of course, that ended up not being the case. And I guess we'll go ahead with that being said and jump into a little more reaction from yesterday's game between Indiana and Oregon. And if you missed yesterday's post-game wrap-up show with myself and Kyler Staley, feel free to check that out, of course, right here on the Hoosier Illustrated YouTube channel. You can check that out and hear our near immediate thoughts. We didn't start immediately after the game ended. He had to get situated in a different location. You can hear our more raw thoughts on what happened between Indiana and Oregon, whereas this will be more big picture stuff. So, of course, Indiana loses to Oregon for the second time this season, second time in less than 10 days. And I feel like the game overall, I'd say for 70% of the game, Indiana played pretty good basketball. But that's really, the peak of what we saw yesterday. I don't think they played a horrible game. Malik Renew, of course, had a really good showing off the bench once again. 19 points, led all scores. Unfortunately, not getting the win for Indiana, even though he was the leading scorer. But outside of that, you had some pretty up and down, inconsistent performances. Luke Goody couldn't hit a three-pointer to save his life, unfortunately. And I know that sounds like I'm being hard on him. Like some days you're just cold, and that was the case for him. Anthony Leal, while he did play some good defense, he missed a couple of important shots down the stretch, especially those free throws late in the game where you could have cut it to 4, if I'm not mistaken. And that was in a spurt where Indiana was just missing easy shot after easy shot. And it wasn't just Anthony Leal, it was a couple of other guys as well. And that really felt like that was the defining stretch for how that game was going to turn out. And credit to Oregon, of course. They are now on, I believe, a 7, maybe 8-game winning streak, I'm not mistaken. And by the time this episode releases, they will be likely several minutes into their quarterfinal round game against Michigan State. So will that winning streak continue against the top team in the conference? We'll have to wait and see. But nonetheless, that's not a bad Oregon team that Indiana lost to. If you watched the broadcast yesterday, you probably saw the Big Ten Network show this up on the screen and talk about it a couple of times. Apparently, Oregon, since 2010 and 2011, they have the most wins in the month of March out of any team in college basketball, more than Kentucky, Kansas, UNC, any of the blue bloods that you want to name. And some of those have won championships since then. Oregon has more overall wins in the month of March than any other program. And so Dana Altman has that program about as steady as it could be without actually winning anything I say anything. I think they won the Pac-12 tournament championship last year, so I'm not trying to take that away from them. But I guess I'm talking about winning, the big one, the national championship. And maybe they go on a run and do something close to that, or even that in and of itself this year. I wouldn't expect that out of Oregon. But either way, unfortunate to see Indiana losing. That's what we're sitting here today, and Indiana is going to have to sweat out Selection Sunday and be thinking about whether or not they're going to make the tournament. And if you heard any of the press conferences yesterday, a lot of the players, and of course Mike Woodson as well, made their case on whether or not they should be included in the tournament. And as much as I don't want to rag on anybody, and I understand all of those players want to be in, and I want them to be in, but some of the cases that they made, like whenever you say you have good losses on your resume, I just feel like it's very defeatist. Maybe that's not the best word to use describing that, but whenever you're trying to convince someone that you should be in because you have good losses, you know what it sounds like? It sounds like the SEC in football. Because they act like they should still be in the college football playoff with an 8-4 record because they lost to Alabama and Georgia and Florida. You name your SEC team. Mentioning you have good losses, I don't feel like is ever a good argument, in my opinion. And I don't know if it was just one particular Indiana player that mentioned that yesterday, or if there was a few that went down that road. I don't have all of the transcripts in front of me, but I do believe Trey Galloway probably had the most honest answer. And again, I wish I had it pulled up so I could say verbatim what he said. But either way, Indiana does have a case. Their best argument they have is that they don't have any quad 2, 3, or 4 losses. That's the number one argument they have. the problem is they have a lot of quad one losses. I mean, that's it. Every loss they have, which is it, what, 13 now, 14? Either way, it's all their losses. They're all quad one losses. And the other issue you run into now is the fact that a lot of other teams that are on the bubble with you won their games yesterday. Now, Xavier did not. They took Marquette down to the wire. But North Carolina still battling in the ACC tournament. Texas still battling in the SEC tournament. And again, I guess with that, I'll go ahead and jump on over to Joe Lunardi's bracketology so I can kind of extend this conversation into that. But if you look at, I'll just look at the four categories, the on the bubble categories. Right now, Joe Lunardi has Arkansas, Vanderbilt, Utah State, and West Virginia as his last four buys. So Arkansas also, they lost to Ole Miss yesterday. So that, I didn't realize how safely Lunardi had Arkansas in the tournament, but they have reached 20 wins in a difficult SEC this year. So I guess I shouldn't be as surprised. But the last four in currently for Joe Lunardi: San Diego State, Xavier, North Carolina, and Texas. Indiana currently the first team out in Lunardi's bracketology, followed by Ohio State, Boise State, and Colorado State. And then your next four out: Dayton, UC Irvine, Wake Forest, and Villanova. So again, when you're that close, when you're on that, basically the margin of what's different, right? You're in and you're out. That means there's plenty of room for error, of course, in Lunardi's projections. And we know that he's been wrong many a time. And who knows what the NCAA committee will think. But if teams like North Carolina and Texas keep advancing in their respective conference tournaments, then that's only going to be more problematic for Indiana when you head into Selection Sunday and when you're sitting around waiting for the reveal. I tend to think Indiana still might be let in. And again, it goes back to the argument of no quad one losses. And I think, I was saying this to somebody earlier this morning, I think a really fun matchup for Indiana would be if they got to face Arkansas in Dayton, simply because of John Calipari being the head coach there. That would be a fun storyline in and of itself. So be hoping and praying that Indiana gets in, of course, just so they can be a part of the fun of March Madness. And if they don't, then that's it. That's at that point where all eyes are on the head coaches that may or may not end up being the one who roams Indiana's sideline next season. And I guess with that being said, that's a good time to transition into the next thing on the docket, and that is a couple of different reports that came out yesterday that has led to these two particular head coaches being named kind of the unofficial finalists for the job. And that doesn't mean that this is exactly how it will play out being one of these two guys, but the two, well, we'll just go ahead and get into it because I tend to ramble whenever I try to beat around the bush a little more than I should. But yesterday, a little after 5:30, Jeff Goodman posted this on Twitter. He said, Drake coach Ben McCollum has emerged as one of the top candidates for the Indiana opening and has really impressed Indiana AD Scott Dolson, source told the Field of 68. And then he goes on to mention a couple of different notable things about Ben McCollum. So that was kind of the first piece of news that really got people rolling yesterday and kind of got me excited because I have been on, as many of you know who listen to the show regularly, I've been on the Ben McCollum train for a while, even though I do have a couple of reservations that have been brought to my attention, which there's going to be reservations with any head coach, right? But I just am really drawn to the young coach that has had so much success at lower levels. It's not the exact story as Curt Cignetti with Indiana football, but it is similar in terms that both head coaches have come from lower level backgrounds and have eventually made it to a power program. And the biggest difference being their age, of course. Ben McCollum, I think I saw, is 43 years old, whereas Curt Cignetti is 64 going on 65, if I'm not mistaken. So that's kind of my biggest thing with Ben McCollum is if you if he works out, if you get him, first of all, and he works out with Indiana, he's somebody who could be at your program for a very, very long time if he is able to remain happy in Bloomington. But another job that I haven't checked today to see if this job is open just yet, and but it's expected to at this point, and that is Fran McCaffrey at Iowa. Funny thing of note, he got ejected during his game yesterday against who was it that Iowa was playing? It doesn't matter. Either way, he got ejected, and a lot of people are anticipating that job to open up now. I don't believe that was to be the case a couple of weeks ago. But that's definitely something to keep an eye on. And since then, since all of the Iowa nonsense, I should say, this morning, Rick Bozich of WDRB put this on social media a little after 10 o'clock. He said, on Thursday, Drake coach Ben McCollum was the hot name for Indiana basketball. And then he says, my sources say Clemson's Brad Brownell is number 1 and McCollum is now number 2. And so, with that being said, that's the name that we haven't really talked about at all on this show. And I think it's now is as good a time as ever to kind of do a bit of do we call it a deep dive into what Brad Brownell is all about at Clemson? And I'll say this, I think it would be, at least for me, I'm sure there's some who would rather have somebody who's been coaching at a power program like Clemson, and not necessarily like Clemson, but a power program. He just happens to be at Clemson. And then there are some who will want more of the higher risk, high reward with Ben McCollum, that sort of thing. If we're looking at Brad Brownell, though, and his career, which has been a lengthy one, he's in his mid-60s, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, he's 56 years old, and he's had a few different stops. He began his Division I coaching career at UNC Wilmington. He's been there, or he was there for 4 seasons, took him to the NCAA tournament twice in his first and fourth years. Both tournament runs ended in the round of 64, and then went to Wright State right afterward, was there for 4 more seasons, only took him to the tournament once. Again, didn't get past the round of 64. And I'll go ahead and mention this too. Up until this point, the first 8 seasons that I've mentioned, he's not had a losing record through that point in his career. In his first 4 years at UNC Wilmington, he had 2 years where he won 24 and 25 games. In year 2 and 3, he won 15, and then 19. He was 500 in his second season. And then at Wright State, he won 23, 21, and then 20 and 20 in those respective seasons. And then since then, he's been at Clemson since the 2010-2011 season. So a very lengthy tenure at Clemson. And I'll just go ahead and give you some of his postseason results for his time down in South Carolina. His first year at Clemson, he took them to the tournament, just the round of 64. They didn't get out of the first round. Missed the tournament the second and third seasons. Went to the NIT in season number 4. Followed that with 2 more missed tournament appearances, and then another. I say missed tournament. There's a lot of missed NCAA tournaments in the early portion of his career, which isn't something that people would probably be very excited about. But in 2017, 2018, he took Clemson to the second weekend for the first time, went to the Sweet 16, followed that up with an NIT second round appearance. And then after that, you had the year where COVID canceled March Madness, so there was no postseason there. Even if there was, Clemson was 16 and 15 that season. So unless they would have won their conference tournament, they would not have gotten into the NCAA tournament. And then in 2021, went back to March Madness and didn't get out of the round of 64. Followed that up with missing the tournament once again for 2 straight seasons. But he had his breakthrough year last year where he got Clemson all the way to the Elite 8. And this season, he's currently having the best regular season of his career as a head coach. He has Clemson currently at 26-5. They are the 3 seed in the ACC tournament. They'll be taking on Louisville later on tonight. And, you know, it's kind of, what do we even call this? I almost wanted to call it a Tom Crean situation where, you know, he had a lot of good years, but there was times where he had, you know, he was able to get the Final Four, but except Brad Brownell doesn't have a Final Four on his resume. And if he's able to go on a deep run this season, maybe that is something that will make him seem more appealing. Because when I look at his overall, especially with Clemson, and I know Clemson doesn't have the resources that an Indiana has, but the fact that he's only made it to the second weekend twice, and every other, I mean, he's either made it to the second weekend or missed out or lost in the first round of the tournament is what I should say. Those are throughout his entire career, I should say, that's kind of his NCAA tournament resume. He's been to the NIT quite a few times, and of course, never had a Final Four run. But as I mentioned earlier, he's currently having the best season he's ever had with Clemson. But we should also mention this, and it's something I've mentioned before, not when it, how it measures up with Clemson, but the ACC, probably the weakest ACC that I've ever seen, that any of us have ever seen, at least in the last several years. And that could obviously be attributed to part of why they're so successful. Now, that would be also, you'd have to say the same thing about Duke and Louisville as well, because all three of those teams are having really good seasons. But is the gap from those three teams and the rest of the conference that much greater than everyone else? That's kind of what remains to be seen with all of that. So I guess now that I've laid all of that out, what are my thoughts on Brad Brownell? I put this on social media earlier today after I saw that report from Rick Bozich. I think I would feel a lot more excited about Brad Brownell if he's able to make another deep tournament run this year. If they are one and done for, again, yet another time in his lengthy career at Clemson, and even before that, I don't think that would be considered a splash hire. And maybe Ben McCollum wouldn't be considered a splash either. I think it would be. And I think more people would see Ben McCollum as a splash than Brad Brownell, especially because he's been at Clemson for as long as he has. Maybe that's the thing, though. Maybe he's just looking for something a little more, just something different, something with more resources, as I mentioned earlier. And maybe he'll be able to be more consistently successful with that. And we also got to remember, too, with Ben McCollum, one thing that's been brought to my attention, not even just the style of play that can be off-putting, but he's never ever been at a program that has high-level resources. And I know I was just talking about resource issues with Clemson, but they're still a power program. Whereas Ben McCollum has been at Division II for a very, very long time. He's only had one season at the Division I level with Drake, and again, a mid-major program with a lot lower resources than most. But he's also shown that doesn't matter. But the point with that being is he's going to have to learn to manage those resources no matter where he's at, whether it's Indiana, whether it's Iowa, or somewhere else. I firmly believe Ben McCollum will be at either Indiana or Iowa next season. But when it comes to that factor for him, I think that's maybe the second drawback when it comes to someone like McCollum. Like, will that stuff prove to be, too much of an overwhelming nuisance for him, that sort of thing? I don't tend to think that it would, because people made the same argument with Kurt Cignetti. I remember somebody had asked Cignetti if he had ever really worked with NIL at James Madison, and they had a collective and everything, but up until he got to Indiana, that had never really been a part of, what he had to do. And so anytime you're making a big leap like that to a major program, that's going to be an adjustment for anybody. It'll, like Brad Brownell, if he ends up being the guy that goes to Indiana, he's going to have, a lot more things to manage than what he's got at Clemson right now. Because as we've mentioned before with other places, Clemson basketball will always be second fiddle to Clemson football. Now, even though Indiana football has made leaps and bounds better than where they have ever been, when it comes to what the fans care about the most, basketball will always be number one at Indiana, and therefore a significantly larger amount of resources will always be poured into Indiana basketball as opposed to several other places. There's some exceptions, of course, but Indiana is in one of the rare situations where Indiana basketball will always be a high priority. And maybe that's something at Clemson. And you know what? When you look at Clemson football, like when you have somebody like Dabo Swinney, who's always kind of avoided the new, the NIL and the transfer portal, he hates all that stuff. So they haven't really needed. Clemson's not necessarily the first football program that comes to mind when you think of, all their money goes to football. You usually think of the SEC schools or one of the non-Dabo Swinney-led football programs in the ACC. And so maybe that's not necessarily an issue there, but who knows? Nonetheless, I think it's safe to say that at this point, and by the way, I don't know if you heard that through the microphone, sometimes whenever I'm doing this show, I start playing with these little things. They're just kind of fun, little fidgety things to have. I don't even know what they are, but I always end up dropping one of them. There's two of these. I've got one of them right now, but 3 times now I've dropped the second one, and it's just, I guess letting you a little behind the scenes for that sort of thing. But with that back now that I've stun locked myself, let's unstun and kind of wrap up this portion of the show real quick. And I think it's safe to say that at this point, all eyes are going to be on both Ben McCollum and Brad Brownell for, the remainder of this postseason if you're Indiana. Even if Indiana's participating in the NCAA tournament, everyone's going to be curious as to what both of those other teams are doing and what inevitably happens when their team bows out. And it does kind of beg the question. There's a couple different questions, actually. You could look at this, by the way. But is it going to come down to whichever team loses first? Is that going to be who gets the Indiana job, or will Indiana wait out for the one that they want over the other, right? Because maybe Ben McCollum, maybe he was initially interested in Indiana, but now things have turned to where he's like, you know what? I'm from Iowa City. I'd rather coach at the University of Iowa compared to Indiana at this point. And he's not an alum of Iowa. He just grew up in Iowa City. And so maybe, and also the timing of that makes me think, like, did the tide turn to Brad Brownell because McCollum is looking more towards his home state as opposed to going to Indiana? So I mean, maybe we'll never know the answer to that, or we'll probably eventually know, because here's what will happen. If Ben McCollum and Drake lose in the NCAA tournament before Clemson and Brad Brownell, and the Iowa job, if it opens up, if the Iowa job fills up before the Indiana job, then that means we know that Ben McCollum, we know one of two things. Either his first choice was Iowa, or Indiana's first choice was Brad Brownell. One of those two things, if not both, could be true at that point, right? But if Brad Brownell and Clemson lose first and Indiana goes with Brad Brownell, I guess it's more than likely that he was their number one guy. But if Clemson loses and it's not Brad Brownell, then there's plenty of reason to believe that it would be Ben McCollum at that point. So I feel like we've covered all of the bases when it comes to the latest on the coaching search. And I hope I was able to, kind of break it down in a good enough way for you guys. Because honestly, that was really fun for me to kind of examine along with you all. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens over these next few weeks as the NCAA tournament gets underway. Hopefully we'll get to see Indiana in it as well. But let's go ahead and wrap up with a YouTube comment, and then we'll close out today's show. Justin Beard said this. He was commenting on Wednesday's show. Pat Kelsey deserves the Coach of the Year award. Louisville deserves success after the past few years of poopy. It should be an awesome Big Ten tournament. And, of course, unfortunately, Indiana no longer playing in the Big Ten tournament. And I believe you're commenting on that based on the hope that I had that Indiana would play against Louisville if they indeed met in the NCAA tournament, or if they indeed made the NCAA tournament. And that's true. Yes, Pat Kelsey. I heard somebody say this earlier. And actually, I shouldn't even mention what I'm about to say because I'm going to butcher it because I don't know exactly what the statistic was. But the big picture of it, Pat Kelsey's had one of the craziest turnarounds in not only Louisville history, but in college basketball history from one regime to the next. And I think he's great. I think Louisville struck gold, kind of similar to how Indiana football struck gold with Kurt Signetti. And I foresee Pat Kelsey being really good at Louisville for a long time. Now, if the ACC improves, yeah, maybe they won't have as good of a season in the next year or two, or maybe they will. Who knows? But it'll be interesting, kind of just like it'll be interesting to see with Signetti, like how they handle a tougher schedule in future seasons, how much of their success is because of the schedule versus how good Pat Kelsey has put together that team. So it'll be interesting to see how well. I mean, I was actually thinking about this earlier. And by the way, I know I'm kind of jumping all over the place now. Both Louisville and Kentucky last night in their conference tournament games hit buzzer beaters. It was Chucky Hepburn for Louisville. I don't know if you saw this, but they were playing Stanford. Stanford was going for the rebound, and one of the Stanford players tosses it out to the perimeter, and Chucky Hepburn is just sitting there. And the ball lands in his hands. He tosses it up. Buzzer-beating win for Louisville. And then Kentucky, Otega Owe, they're playing Oklahoma. Otega Owe is the player for Kentucky I'm referring to. Kentucky was playing Oklahoma, and Otega Owe, for the second time this season against his former school, Oklahoma, hits a game-winning shot. It's just, first of all, it's already insane enough to have, two game-winning, plays like that in the same night with your rival schools. But the two situations and how they played out are insane to me. Honestly, don't remember what I was even saying before this now, but two really good finishes in those games, and I'm sure there's plenty more to come. But I guess I'll go ahead and wrap this up. I totally lost my train of thought as I was jumping around from idea to idea that was popping into my head. But either way, we still covered everything that I wanted to get into on today's episode, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. And I look forward to seeing what happens on Sunday. So until then, and until Monday, this has been another edition of In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com.